Right now, there are approximately 1.4 million work permits that have expired or will expire this year. As IRCC tries to reduce the number of non-permanent residents in Canada and overall immigration levels are lower than they have been in recent years, pathways to PR are harder to navigate and a little bit longer than we've experienced in the past. And something I tell most of my clients these days is that you have to have two parallel strategies. One being your permanent resident strategy, and the other being a work permit strategy that's going to bridge the gap between your work permit expiry and when you actually have the opportunity to apply for permanent residence. But what I see every single day are people who have waited too long. Maybe they got bad advice, they weren't aware of their options, or they went ahead with an application that actually wasn't the best move. So today I'm going to show you the exact strategy and approach I take when someone comes to me and says, my work permit's expiring, my express entry CRS score is too low, what do I do next? This is my approach to identifying ways to extend somebody's authorization to work in Canada. And I've actually built a free quiz in Navio HQ. The link's in the comments. You can click to join HQ. It's our free tools hub where you have access to all sorts of quizzes, guides, templates to help you on your Canadian immigration journey. And today I'm going to walk you through the work permit selection quiz, which I tried to distill and take my method of identifying work permit opportunities into a quiz that you can use and apply to your situation. So we're going to walk through that today. My name is Brooke Finley. I'm the founder of Navio and a regulated Canadian immigration consultant. And I'm going to show you how we actually find work permit options for our clients. But before I show you the process, I want to address something that I am asked on a regular basis, and that is about dummy or fake applications that are all the rage on Reddit and other forums as a way to extend a stay in Canada. And a dummy application is something where you submit an application to extend your stay and authorization to work in Canada before your current work permit expires for the purpose of triggering what's called maintained status. So if you apply to extend your stay and authorization to work before your current work permit expires, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act and regulations stipulates that your status extends while you wait for a decision to be made on that extension application, as long as you made the application before the previous work permit expired. Now, the issue is people are submitting applications that don't have merit. They're not aligned with any of the work permit categories. No evidence of eligibility is included, and people are submitting these applications simply to trigger maintained status. For example, someone that extends a postgraduate work permit after they've had the full duration for which they were eligible, that's a dummy application because postgraduate work permit isn't one for which you're eligible to extend. Same with International Experience Canada working holiday permits. These permits are, in most cases, not eligible for extension. And if you apply to extend and just simply submit the paperwork in your passport and other supporting documents like that, that's what we're referring to as a dummy application. You're not actually eligible. So instead, we have to look at all the work permit options and align your application for extension with something for which you actually qualify. And that's what I'm going to walk you through today. Because the risk is, with IRCC's advancements in technology, they pick up on these applications and they refuse them quickly. And ultimately, that backfires for you because now your extended period of authorized work has been cut short. So here's what I do instead. Every time somebody comes to me with a work permit expiry, I map their situation, their employer, their occupation, their nationality, their family situation. Then I evaluate every single LMA exempt work permit category. So now I'm going to pull up the work permit category quiz. This is the free quiz you can find in Navio HQ, our free tools portal. And I'm going to walk you through how I evaluate the LMIA exempt work permit categories to find options that will help people genuinely apply to extend their authorization to stay and work in Canada. All right, so we've got a little preamble here, which you can read on your own, and down to the question. So I always start with a person's age because many people that are between 18 to 35 might be eligible for a working holiday permit, a young professional, or an international co-op work permit under the International Experience Canada program. This is the lowest hanging fruit, so that's why I start there. I always look for what's the easiest, fastest, cheapest way to extend our stay. And the IEC is it. So if you're between 18 to 35, go to question 2. Do you hold a passport from an IEC eligible country? I've linked the countries here. If yes, then I explore eligibility. Now, many people that I speak to who are in Canada with a work permit expiry approaching have used their participation in the International Experience Canada program because you're limited in the number of times you can participate. But sometimes you're permitted a second participation in another category. And by that, I mean, if you had a working holiday, you might be able to apply for a young professional. If not, you can participate again through a recognized organization. Now, they are in high demand, but still the option is there and worth exploring. Also, if you are a dual citizen and both countries are participants in the International Experience Canada program, you can participate the maximum number of participations per country. Now, if you are not 18 to 35 or your country is not on the list of eligible countries for IEC, go to question 3. If you are somebody who is in Canada being sponsored for permanent residence by your Canadian common law partner or married spouse, then you might be eligible for an open work permit. So this is quite niche, but putting it there, if that applies to you, then there's a work permit specifically for you. If not, we move to question 4. If you graduated from a post-secondary institution within the last 150 days, then you may be eligible for a post-graduation work permit. Now, this gets a little bit tricky because the eligibility criteria for that permit have changed drastically over the last couple of years. So if that is you, if you've studied in Canada, look very closely and carefully at the eligibility criteria and the dates and determine whether or not you're someone who is eligible as an international graduate for a post-graduation work permit, which is an open work permit typically spanning between 1 and 3 years. If you haven't graduated from a Canadian educational institution, we're going to jump to question 5. Do you have a Canadian employer ready and willing to hire you full-time and support the paperwork? And you'll see here, don't worry about the jargon. I use support because an employer's involvement in your work permit application can look very different from one work permit to another. And I find when people use the word sponsor, the mind of an employer typically goes to a labor market impact assessment, and you might get a no from the employer quite quickly if you use the word sponsor and they automatically assume you mean LMIA. So I like to use the word support. Will your employer, are they willing to explore how they might support you in securing a work permit? So if the answer is yes, then I go to question 6. The first option I look at for an employer-supported work permit is the Francophone mobility permit. So this is for individuals with CLB level 5 in speaking and listening in French who are planning to or already living and working outside of Quebec and have a job offer from an employer in Canada. If that's not you, then my next question is, are you transferring to the Canadian branch of a company that has operations outside of Canada? And this is relevant to people who are working in managerial, executive, or specialized knowledge occupations, because If that's you, then there may be options through the intra-company transfer that allow multinational corporations to move key staff and executive level staff to the Canadian operations. And that can include coming to Canada to establish operations in Canada in certain circumstances. So lots of opportunity there. We work a lot in the intercompany transfer space. And that, again, is if you're working for a company that has global presence and you're moving to the operations in Canada. The next thing I explore is whether or not you have a spouse or common law partner who's accompanying you here in Canada. Because when you do, I look at each person individually to see what their eligibility is on their own merit, separate of their partner. And so if you have a spouse who has or is eligible for a work permit, then I look at whether or not you are eligible for a work permit as the spouse of a skilled worker in Canada. And to qualify, your spouse has to be working in a tier 0, 1, 2, or 3 occupation, and their permit has to be valid for at least 16 months. If they're working in a 0 or 1 occupation, then you're good to go. If they're working in a tier 2 or 3 occupation, then it has to be an occupation that's on one of the designated lists in order for you to be eligible to apply for the spouse open work permit as the partner of a skilled worker. Again, you'll see all the links are in the quiz to take you directly to IRCC's website where you'll find eligibility for each one of these permits. So you can just systematically work through this quiz. If a situation sounds like it might be similar to yours, then click the link and read further about the eligibility criteria. And if it doesn't apply or you find out you're not eligible, then move on to the next question in the quiz. Now you'll see here question 9, if none of them fit, what I've done is I have linked to IRCC's website that lists every single LMIA exempt type of work permit because there are over 50 of them. So if none of the types of work permits that are suggested in questions 1 through 8 apply to you, then don't be discouraged. Jump into the IRCC's website. I'll show you here, and you can go every single category by category here. And again, these are LMIA exempt work permits. They fall under the International Mobility Program. And so that's in contrast to the LMIA-based work permits, which come under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. So there's 2 main groups of work permits, International Mobility Program and Temporary Foreign Worker Program. Temporary Foreign Worker Program is basically synonymous with LMIAs, whereas International Mobility Program has such a wide variety of types of permits and eligibility criteria, and they are LMIA exempt. So these are the types of work permits that your employer needs to submit an offer of employment through the employer portal. If your employer's submitting an LMIA and has been approved, they don't have to use the employer portal because they've gone through the LMIA process. I'll show you a few more types of work permits that we often use that fall into the International Mobility Program. So as I mentioned, you can literally go through each and every one of these to see if there's one that applies to your situation. I look at a lot of free trade agreements. So that's this category here, R204. And if you're from one of the countries that has a free trade agreement with Canada, those free trade agreements also facilitate movement of people. And within the free trade agreement, there's generally the same categories. We have the professionals category. So most free trade agreements list the occupations, the professional occupations that are included and covered by the agreement. And if you have an opportunity, an employment opportunity, or sometimes it's a contract for service with an employer in Canada in one of these occupations that's listed in the free trade agreement, then a work permit is possible. There's also intercompany transfers that are facilitated through the free trade agreement. And the biggest difference between general intercompany transfer and an intercompany transfer under one of the free trade agreements is that in the general intercompany transfer, the company needs to be a multinational corporation. So there needs to be locations and operations of the company in at least 2 other locations outside of Canada. And that's true also if the company is establishing presence for the first time in Canada in this intercompany transfer. Whereas under the free trade agreements, that's not the case. You can have operations in one country and Canada, or just have the operations in one country and then be establishing the Canadian entity. And that can be facilitated through an intercompany transfer under a free trade agreement. It doesn't have to be a multinational corporation or have operations in at least 2 other countries when it's under a free trade agreement. So you'll see 𝐀𝐻MA, Canada, US, Mexico. Again, you can see each one: professionals, intercompany transfers. As I mentioned before, the intercompany transfer applies to executives, senior managers, and specialized knowledge workers. There's also investors and traders. So those are more unique. I've done a handful of those, but definitely a niche. And there's also Colombia, Chile, South Korea, Panama, Peru, the GATS, and EU, the CPTPP, which includes Australia and UK. Okay, and then we also have Ukraine, but those aren't in force yet. Some other really interesting options here are the significant benefit category. So I actually did an entire video on the significant benefit C10. It's called often because that's the LMIA exemption code. You can see it highlighted there. I've done a whole other video. I'll link it below, but that requires a full separate session to cover that one. But it's something we're using more and more given that squeeze on the availability of work permits, particularly LMIAs and the restriction on LMIAs. Entrepreneurs, there's C11 work permit, and this is where you'll find, this is the general ICT intercompany transfer that I was referring to, falls under C61 to 3. And another really interesting one that's coming up is reciprocal employment. So this is R205B, reciprocal employment. We've done a lot of these for coaches. You can see it here. It has its separate LMIA exemption code, but it falls under reciprocal employment. It's also came up in a conversation I had with someone employed at a global hotel chain, because the guidance for reciprocal employment says that if you are employed and the company has an HR strategy, like a global mobility strategy, then it's possible to secure a work permit when you can demonstrate that there are similar opportunities available to Canadians to take up work in your country of citizenship. So that's a really interesting one to look into, especially if you work at a large corporation with locations in other countries. Francophone mobility, as I mentioned. There's also charitable work. So if you're working for an organization that has charitable status that advances certain objectives as defined by the CRA when they issue that charitable status designation, that could be an option. And it's an interesting one. I can do a separate video on that one, particularly because it's quite interesting and requires a lot of detail and consideration. But just, I wanted to point it out because it's not as restrictive as you might think. So have a look at that. I'll even just pop into it for a second. But you can see you are working with an organization that is, if you're working in an organization that's a registered charity or not, if it's still falls within the definition of a charitable organization, which is defined here as something working towards relief of poverty, advancement of education, advancement of religion, and certain other purposes that benefit the community. Again, it goes by CRA's definition. Then you might be eligible for a work permit under this category. So as I said, lots and lots of options. And if nothing is applicable to your situation, then I go and look at whether or not an LMIA is viable and if your employer is willing to support your application for a new work permit by applying for an LMIA. And in that case, the employer has to undertake a significant amount of advertising. It just recently got updated to 8 weeks for low wage LMIAs, which are any job offer that falls under the provincial median. Employers had to advertise for a period of 8 weeks, extensively make a really genuine effort to hire Canadians. And if they're not able to hire a Canadian, identify somebody with the skills, the experience or education to fill the role, or the availability and willingness to fill the role, then that's a circumstance where an employer could submit an application for labor market impact assessment, which gives them authorization to hire a foreign worker. And if they name you on that approval, then you can apply for a work permit under the temporary foreign worker program based on that approved LMIA. LMIA is always the last option I look at because it takes longer, it costs more, and it's a lot more burdensome. So if you qualify under one of the exempt categories, that's always my default. And one last thing I want to mention as you're planning your work permit extension strategy is that what you do now needs to align with what you're hoping to accomplish in the future. So knowing what your PR options are and making sure that you are aligning the work permit strategy with the longer term PR strategy is really important. And I see people make this mistake where they don't consider the implications of applying for a certain type of work permit with a particular employer or in a particular occupation, and then it can close off the doors to certain PR options. So that's really important. And what I like to do, and this is a whole another session I'll record a video on, but what I like to do when I determine PR strategy is I start with the PR and then I reverse engineer everything to today's date and where we are now so that every action, every decision I'm making now is pointing me in the right direction because, as you can imagine, any slight deviance now over time, it really can derail you from your long-term goals. I'll give you an example is someone that's on a closed employer and occupation specific work permit, but is maybe striving to qualify for one of the express entry category based draws. Even, if you don't have authorization to work in the occupation that's on the category based list, then you're misaligned. Your work permit strategy is misaligned with the PR strategy. And I actually had somebody who was asking about being able to apply through one of the category-based draws. They'd been given advice to get their employer to write a letter saying they'd been in a certain occupation. But the reality is this person had a closed work permit for an occupation that was not the one listed on the category list. And so had they proceeded, they would have failed because IRCC would have looked at that and said, you didn't do that job. And if you did do that job, you weren't authorized to work in that occupation. So that's what I mean when I say the PR and the work permit strategy have to work in parallel. You have to know the end goal, or at least to the best of your ability, because things can change, but plan backwards, reverse engineer so you have the highest chance of everything lining up and ultimately reaching your long-term goals. Again, if you want to find out what work permit categories might fit your situation, you can access the work permit quiz that I just walked you through by joining Navio HQ. It's our free tools portal, and the work permit quiz lives there along with all sorts of other tools, templates, guides, and other quizzes, including a PR selection quiz. So click the link below to join Navio HQ. And if you want to ask me your specific questions directly, I hold bi-weekly Ask Me Anything sessions. You can also sign up for that through Navio HQ. Bring your questions. It's an open live session. every other Wednesday, and I'll tell you exactly how I would approach your situation or how I would think about answering the questions that you have on your mind.